The outbreak of war in September 1939 produced countless headlines, but one detail rarely made print. Within days of the German invasion of Poland, the British Admiralty quietly activated a small, highly restricted division, an inner circle of naval strategists and intelligence officers whose task was to devise operations so sensitive they would be hidden for generations. These men and women worked in windowless rooms beneath Whitehall, far from the noise of the surface world, drafting plans that would push the boundaries of clandestine warfare at sea. Their brief was simple. When the Royal Navy's conventional methods failed to blunt the German threat, they would step forward with operations that defied convention entirely. By the end of 1939, Britain faced a rapidly tightening noose in the Atlantic. German U-boats, operating in coordinated wolf packs, were sinking merchant ships at a pace that stunned Allied planners. Convoys carrying food, fuel, and weapons, vital arteries for Britain's survival, were being cut off under the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic. Rear Admiral Max Horton, head of Western Approaches Command, privately wrote that the U-boat menace felt less like a campaign and more like a creeping suffocation. Yet, even as the crisis deepened, official communications remained measured. The public would never know just how close Britain came to losing the Atlantic altogether in those early months. Inside the Admiralty's secret division, however, the tone was anything but calm. The struggle was immediate and visceral. Traditional convoy escorts were stretched beyond capacity, and the Royal Navy had few tools to counter the stealth of submarines operating hundreds of miles from any friendly base. It became clear that defeating the U-boats through ordinary means was unlikely. Something unconventional, something covert, was required. According to newly surfaced memos, it was in these tense winter months that the Admiralty began shaping what would become a series of classified operations, each designed to strike at the German war machine where it was least guarded. One entry in a naval officer's diary from December 1939 reveals the pressure felt inside these rooms. "We are fighting an enemy we cannot see, against odds we cannot admit. The Prime Minister demands answers, but the answers we have are shadows, ideas, and men willing to risk not only their lives but their anonymity." That anonymity would become a defining trait of Britain's covert naval efforts. Many of the sailors and engineers who would eventually volunteer for special operations were never publicly recognized. Some carried their stories to their graves. Others vanished while training for missions so classified their families received only vague notices of "lost at sea." The insight emerging from these early studies was clear. Covert naval work required technology the Royal Navy did not yet possess. This realization led to frantic research efforts to develop vessels capable of slipping into fortified harbors unnoticed. Engineers at secret workshops in Gosport and Barrow-in-Furness worked on prototypes that seemed nearly impossible, tiny submarines crewed by just 2 or 3 men, unable to dive deep or travel far, but capable of delivering explosive charges beneath enemy ships with surgical precision. Their designs would later evolve into the famous X-Craft, but in 1939 and early 1940, they were little more than sketches pinned to drafting boards. Yet the very act of pursuing these unconventional ideas came with its own risks. Technical accidents during early trials were common, and at least 2 prototype submersibles reportedly sank during tests in 1940. These events, long shrouded in classification, resulted in the disappearance of several crewmen whose names remained sealed in Admiralty archives for decades. The official reports used cautious language, equipment malfunction, erroneous ballast calculations, but later analysts noted that the secrecy surrounding these incidents was unusually heavy, even for wartime. The disappearances reinforced the perilous nature of the work and the enormity of the stakes. As Germany expanded across Europe and prepared its naval forces in the Norwegian fjords and French Atlantic ports, the Admiralty's secret division grew more determined. Covert operations were no longer an experimental idea. They were rapidly becoming a strategic necessity. Rumors circulated among select officers about missions involving unmarked vessels, clandestine approaches to enemy harbors, and sabotage carried out in the dead of night. Most of these whispers never reached the wider fleet. Compartmentalization was absolute. Only those directly involved understood the scope of what was coming, and even they often knew only fragments. Looking back, these early days offer lessons in both desperation and innovation. Britain's survival depended on breaking from tradition and embracing methods considered too unorthodox for peacetime navies. It was this willingness to experiment that would eventually produce some of the most daring operations of the war, missions that blended engineering, intelligence, and sheer human nerve. But in 1939, none of these successes were guaranteed. All that existed was fear, uncertainty, and a belief that secret action might offer the edge Britons so desperately needed. As winter deepened and U-boats continued to stalk the Atlantic, the Admiralty prepared to launch the first of many covert operations, missions that even now, with files newly released, leave lingering questions about the men who undertook them and the price they paid. And it was within this crucible of crisis and secrecy that the seeds of Britain's most classified naval missions were sown, setting the stage for the first operation to finally break through the shadows. In the summer of 1943, deep within the Norwegian fjords, stood a behemoth of German naval power, the battleship Tirpitz. Few outside high command understood just how much fear this single ship cast over the North Atlantic. Though she seldom ventured into open waters, her very existence forced the Royal Navy to divert convoys, reposition major warships, and dedicate enormous resources to tracking her movements. One officer later remarked, "The Tirpitz was less a ship than a shadow over every Allied plan." But what the world did not know, what even many in the Admiralty were never told, was that Britain had devised a mission to penetrate this shadow using a vessel barely the size of a fishing boat. The challenge began with a simple but maddening problem. Traditional naval power had failed to neutralize the Tirpitz. Airstrikes from Scapa Flow and carrier groups achieved little. The fjords around Kafjord were fortified with anti-aircraft guns, torpedo nets, and hydrophone stations. German patrol boats circled constantly, and the jagged geography created natural shields from aerial assault. A daring approach was needed, one that could slip beneath detection, exploit the tiniest vulnerabilities, and strike at the battleship's keel itself. Enter the X-craft midget submarines. Just 51 feet long and manned by only 4 sailors, commander, navigator, engineer, and diver. They were crude, cramped, and perilously unreliable. Inside each steel shell, every inch mattered. Batteries overheated. Hulls creaked. Oxygen supplies were limited. One submarine commander recalled, "It felt less like sailing and more like willingly placing yourself inside a steel coffin." Yet for all their flaws, X-craft could maneuver into places larger submarines could never reach. Their mission: carry 2 massive side-mounted explosive charges into enemy anchorages and attach them to the hull of a target ship. Training for Operation Source began early in 1943 at Loch Cairnbawn in Scotland, under conditions so secretive that many Royal Navy personnel stationed nearby didn't even know the program existed. The crews trained endlessly in the cold, dark waters of the loch, practicing silent approaches, precision navigation, and emergency surfacing drills. They rehearsed attaching explosive charges to mock hulls at night, often surfacing with numb hands and bloodied knuckles from collisions with underwater obstacles. Tension was constant. Equipment failures nearly drowned several crews during tests. Most incidents went unreported. A surviving page from Lieutenant Basil Place's notes captures the psychological strain. The silence becomes its own enemy. You begin to hear sounds that aren't there, engines, footsteps, even voices. But you hold the course because you must. His words echo the atmosphere around the entire operation. The men were preparing not just for a mission, but for an ordeal. Despite the secrecy, a number of unexplained events troubled the program. During towed trials in August 1943, X-9, carrying 2 crewmen, vanished beneath the North Sea without a distress call. The submarine broke its tow line in heavy seas and was never found. Officially, the Admiralty listed the incident as a tragic malfunction. Yet later declassified documents suggested additional complications, potential structural weaknesses, or oxygen system problems that engineers had flagged, but did not have time to fully correct. The disappearance deepened the sense of danger surrounding the mission. But training continued. There was no alternative. By late September 1943, the operational crews were chosen, 6 X-craft to be towed more than 1,000 miles to northern Norway. Once released near the coastline, they would navigate independently through minefields, anti-submarine nets, and patrol zones before reaching Kafjord. Every mile was a hazard. Tows snapped. Batteries failed. One craft had to abort after its commander became incapacitated. Another struck a rock reef near the fjord entrance and sank. Yet even with these losses, 3 X-craft pressed on, creeping into the darkness of the heavily defended anchorage. The moment of truth came on September 22, 1943. X-6, under Lieutenant Donald Cameron, managed to slip through a series of nets after hours of agonizing maneuvering, surfacing briefly inside the fjord to get bearings. Machinery problems plagued the vessel, and at one point Cameron later admitted he believed the mission was already finished. Yet he pressed on. Guided by a mix of instinct, training, and sheer determination, X-6 crawled beneath the massive hull of the Tirpitz. Cameron and his diver placed charges set to detonate hours later. The crew scuttled the craft and were captured shortly after. 2 other crews met similar fates, detected, forced to scuttle their vessels, and taken prisoner. But the charges worked. At 8:15 the next morning, explosions ripped through the fjord, lifting the Tirpitz in the water and causing extensive internal damage. The battleship was crippled for months, unable to threaten Allied convoys or participate in Arctic operations. Despite the operation's partial successes, many details remained hidden for decades, especially concerning the men who vanished in training and the technical failures that nearly doomed the mission. Even now, historians debate whether the Admiralty underestimated the risks placed upon the crews or knowingly proceeded despite flaws in the craft. What remains undeniable is the courage displayed by the submariners who pushed forward into uncertainty. Their story did not end with the Tirpitz. The success of Operation Source emboldened the Admiralty to consider even more unorthodox missions, ones that would push the boundaries of secrecy and human endurance even further. And the next classified operation, conducted far from the icy fjords, would lead to new disappearances and darker questions. Long before dawn broke over the North African coastline in 1941, a different kind of naval operation stirred in the shadows. It had no battleships, no roaring engines, and no thunderous artillery. Instead, its weapon was silence. Few today realize that some of the most daring British naval missions of World War II were carried out not by fleets or submarines, but by small teams of commandos paddling collapsible wooden canoes into Axis-controlled harbors. These were the men of the Special Boat Section, precursors to the modern SBS, whose operations remained so secret that even their families were often unaware of the risks they faced. Among these missions, Operation Rubber stands out for its ambition, its danger, and the unanswered questions it left behind. The struggle began with a strategic reality. By late 1941, Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean were keeping Rommel's Africa Corps alive. Italian merchant vessels, escorted by destroyers and protected by coastal defenses, ferried ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements from ports like Tobruk, Benghazi, and Tripoli. The Royal Navy's surface ships could not approach these harbors without alerting coastal guns, and air raids often failed to hit moving or dispersed targets. A new approach was needed, one that attacked the enemy from inside their own waters. This responsibility fell on a small, highly trained group within the SBS. Their primary tool was the fallbit, a lightweight, 2-man collapsible canoe capable of being disassembled, carried, and reassembled in the water. The idea seemed absurd to many in the Admiralty, commandos sneaking into fortified harbors with little more than paddles and magnetic limpet mines. But the SBS had already demonstrated their skill in covert insertions, and their commander, Major Roger Courtney, believed mobility, stealth, and nerve could achieve what battleships could not. Training for Operation Rubber began in late 1941 at Kabrit, Egypt, on the windswept shores of the Suez Canal. Under moonlit skies, teams practiced low-silhouette paddling, silent beach landings, and rapid limpet mine attachment on mock hulls. Many exercises were conducted under strict blackout conditions, where even the glow of a wristwatch could betray a position. Captain Jock Haselden later noted, "We lived in darkness. We trained in darkness. And most of all, we learned to fear light." The men understood they were preparing for missions where the slightest splash or misstep could be fatal. By mid-1942, intelligence intercepted by Malta-based RAF reconnaissance flights indicated increased Italian convoy traffic in the Gulf of Sirte. The Admiralty approved Operation Rubber, a series of canoe-borne raids targeting supply ships in Axis-held ports. The first strike would focus on Benghazi, where 3 crucial tankers were reportedly anchored under moderate guard. The mission required the SBS to be deployed by submarine, paddle through patrol zones, and infiltrate the harbor without being detected by searchlights or hydrophone stations. On the night of July 12, 1942, the submarine HMS Taku surfaced 10 miles off Benghazi, releasing 2 fallbots into the warm Mediterranean waters. Each canoe carried 2 men, limpet mines, a compass, and rudimentary charts based on outdated Italian harbor maps. It was a plan built on precision and hope. The commandos slipped silently toward the coast, disappearing into darkness. According to the Taku's log, their paddles were barely audible against the sea. But the harbor patrols were more intense than expected. Italian MAS boats, fast and armed, crisscrossed the approaches with erratic searchlight sweeps. Still, the SBS teams pressed on. One canoe successfully reached the outer anchorage, attaching charges to a tanker's hull before retreating to sea. Another team reached the inner harbor but encountered unpredictable current swirls caused by dredging operations. Struggling to maintain control, they narrowly avoided detection when a patrol boat passed within meters. Hours later, explosions echoed across the port, damaging 2 vessels and disrupting Axis logistics for weeks. Not all teams returned. As dawn rose, the Taku waited for extraction signals, 3 short flashes on a shuttered lamp. Only 1 canoe reappeared. The second team, Hardy and Larkin, vanished entirely. Initial intelligence suggested they might have been swept east by a sudden current shift. Italian reports from the period mention hearing splashes near the breakwater around 3 o'clock but recorded no captured commandos. No bodies were recovered. For decades, their fate remained unknown. Recently declassified British files hint at alternative possibilities. One document notes a possible underwater entanglement with harbor nets. Another points to the risk of air pockets within the fallboat's construction failing under pressure if submerged unexpectedly. And yet another, more cryptic, mentions hydrophone anomalies recorded at 2:47. Whether these anomalies represented patrol detection or environmental noise remains uncertain. Historians still debate the most likely scenario. Operation Rubber continued through late 1942, achieving mixed results but demonstrating the potential of small-scale sabotage. The psychological impact on Italian commanders was significant. Reports reveal increased paranoia, doubled patrol schedules, and heightened security across all North African ports. The SBS had become a ghostly threat, silent, unseen, and unpredictable. Today, Operation Rubber offers a modern lesson in asymmetrical warfare. Victory does not always come from firepower, but from ingenuity, daring, and the willingness to challenge conventional thinking. Yet the disappearances associated with these missions continue to cast long shadows. Families received only brief telegrams. Missing. Believed lost on operations. No further details were provided. As the war intensified in 1943, the Admiralty, emboldened by these small successes and haunted by the unanswered questions, shifted focus toward an even more complex and perilous operation in the Arctic, a coordinated, multi-target submersible assault that would push Britain's covert naval forces to their breaking point. The next mission would be bigger, colder, and riskier, and its losses even harder to explain. In the icy waters of northern Norway during 1943, the German Kriegsmarine held some of its most valuable naval assets, heavy warships that threatened the Arctic convoys, supplying the Soviet Union. These convoys, carrying tanks, food, ammunition, and fuel, were Britain's lifeline to an eastern front under enormous pressure. But one detail rarely discussed during the war was how close Germany came to severing that lifeline entirely. Anchored deep within fjords such as Altenfjord and Kafjord lay not just the battleship Tirpitz, but also the cruisers Scharnhorst and Lutzow. Any one of them, if unleashed, could have slaughtered convoy after convoy. Yet instead of deploying battleships or aerial bombardments to neutralize these threats, Britain turned once more to the covert submersible teams whose heroics had already begun reshaping naval strategy. This time, however, the mission would be broader, more coordinated, and infinitely more dangerous. It was called Operation Source. The struggle facing Allied planners was daunting. The fjords of northern Norway were natural fortresses, narrow, twisting waterways flanked by towering cliffs and lined with anti-submarine defenses. Mines, torpedo nets, patrol craft, and hydrophone sensors created layers of protection. German crews lived under constant alert, aware the Royal Navy had attempted multiple air strikes. The Luftwaffe maintained radar outposts on hilltops surrounding the fjords, and U-boats patrolled the approaches. Naval intelligence knew any attempt using conventional submarines or surface craft would be suicidal. But X-craft, small, nimble, and capable of crawling along seabed contours, offered a glimmer of hope. Insight from earlier X-craft missions convinced Admiral Sir Lionel Wells that a large-scale operation targeting multiple capital ships simultaneously could tip the naval balance in the Arctic. Thus, in the spring of 1943, the Admiralty assembled 6 X-craft crews, 12 men in total for the initial attack teams, supported by dozens more engineers, technicians, and towing crews. Their bases were scattered across northern Scotland and the Orkneys, each chosen for its seclusion. Even among Royal Navy personnel, the operation was whispered about rather than openly discussed. Security was so tight that only a fraction of documents were typed. Most were handwritten and personally couriered. Training occurred at Loch Cairnbawn, the same hidden site used for earlier X-craft work. But this time the regimen was harsher. Crews practiced long underwater tows, sometimes lasting 60 to 70 hours, to simulate the journey to Norway. Engineers pushed the experimental submarines to their limits, often exceeding safe endurance parameters. Problems surfaced weekly. Batteries overheated. Periscope optics fogged. Compressors failed unexpectedly. Ventilation was a constant worry. One engineer recorded in his notes, "The oxygen drops too quickly. The carbon dioxide climbs too fast. Men cannot think clearly in such conditions." To prepare for this, crews trained while deliberately fatigued, practicing emergency drills in pitch-black compartments filled with condensation and the sour smell of overworked batteries. The reveal of the operation's true complexity came just weeks before launch. Each X-craft would be towed by a larger submarine across some of the most dangerous waters in the Northern Hemisphere, the Barents Sea. The weather routinely whipped up gales. Ice floes drifted unpredictably. German reconnaissance aircraft frequently swept the region. A single radio intercept could have exposed the entire mission. During these towing rehearsals, tragedy struck again. X-5, commanded by Lieutenant Henniker, suffered mechanical problems so severe that engineers questioned whether it could survive the tow to Norway, let alone the infiltration itself. Another craft, X-8, experienced catastrophic flooding in its explosive charge chamber during trials, forcing its crew to scuttle the submersible. The Admiralty documented these incidents, but later redactions in the operational files left unanswered questions about whether deeper design flaws were known, but ignored due to time pressure. Nevertheless, the remaining X-craft left for Norway in September 1943. Conditions were brutal from the outset. Gale force winds battered the towing submarines. Cables snapped. Crewmen endured exhaustion as the tiny submersibles slammed against waves like tin cans tied to warships. During the crossing, X-10 developed critical mechanical failures that forced it to abort. Yet, despite losses, 3 X-craft, X-6, X-7, and X-5, made their approaches toward Kafjord. The infiltration phase pushed human endurance to its limits. Crews spent upwards of 36 hours submerged in near-freezing water, operating equipment with numb fingers and oxygen levels falling dangerously low. At times, They lay motionless on the seabed to avoid hydrophone sweeps. The fjord's defensive nets required painstaking maneuvering. Some areas were too narrow to turn around, meaning a wrong heading could trap a submarine permanently. On September 22nd, X-6 penetrated the Tirpitz's defenses, placing charges before being detected. X-7 managed similar success, but became entangled in nets while attempting escape. X-5's fate remains one of the operation's mysteries. Officially declared, presumed lost by enemy action, later German reports hint at a small vessel sighted and fired upon near the inner fjord. Whether X-5 launched its charges or was destroyed before reaching its target has never been conclusively proven. When the charges detonated the following morning, the effect was devastating. The Tirpitz was crippled, knocked out for months. Though other target ships survived, the operation reshaped German naval deployment patterns for the rest of the war. Yet operations source came at great cost. Crews were captured, vessels destroyed, and several men vanished entirely, lost to mechanical failures, hostile fire, or the unforgiving Arctic waters. Even after file declassification, historians still debate aspects of the mission, including the full circumstances surrounding X-5's disappearance and whether the Admiralty underestimated the risks. As winter tightened around Northern Europe, the Admiralty redirected its focus far southward, to an operation that would unfold under the cover of colonial diplomacy, targeting Axis shipping in a neutral port. And this next mission would hinge on deception as much as daring. Few World War II naval missions combined diplomacy, deception, and covert action as dangerously as Operation Postmaster. On the surface, it appeared to be a small-scale operation, 3 Axis-controlled vessels moored in the neutral Spanish port of Fernando P, present-day Bioko, Equatorial Guinea. But behind the scenes, the mission represented a rare convergence of naval intelligence, special operations executive, SOE, planning, and political risk. Britain needed these ships removed, yet could not risk a diplomatic incident with Spain, whose fragile neutrality helped shape the balance of power in the Atlantic. Everything about the mission, its planning, its personnel, its execution, would need to occur in total secrecy. And when the files were finally released decades later, new questions emerged about how narrowly the operation avoided exposure and whether the SOE's manipulation of local networks was deeper than officially acknowledged. The struggle began with a threat emerging far from Europe. In 1941-42, German and Italian agents stationed in West Africa used neutral ports to monitor Allied shipping routes and pass intelligence to U-boats operating in the mid-Atlantic. 3 vessels in particular, the German tug La Comba, the Italian merchant ship Duchessa d'Aosta, and a smaller craft used as a radio relay, formed a covert Axis logistics hub in Fernando P. Intelligence from British West Africa Command reported unusually high radio traffic originating from the island, much of it coinciding with U-boat successes. However, because the port was under Spanish control, Allied forces could not legally interfere. Enter the SOE's West Africa Division under Major Gus March Phillips, leader of the small, unorthodox force known as the Maid Honor Force. Formed from an eclectic mix of commandos, former colonial officers, and naval adventurers, the unit specialized in deceptive coastal raids. March Phillips proposed a bold plan: infiltrate the harbor at night, neutralize the Axis crews without firing a shot, silently board all 3 ships, and tow them to British-held Nigeria. The Admiralty initially balked. The risk of provoking Spain, and, by extension weakening British diplomatic leverage, was immense. But with the U-boat war worsening, the SOE received covert approval. Training shifted to the Gold Coast, now Ghana, where the raiders practiced silent boarding drills and close-quarters takedowns aboard derelict vessels. Sappers rehearsed disabling communications lines using insulated wire cutters supplied by the Royal Navy. March Phillips insisted that the operation revolve around 2 principles: surprise and speed. No shooting, no shouting, no second chances, he wrote in a directive. The team trained relentlessly, crawling across decks at night, clambering over mooring lines, and simulating the rapid attachment of tow cables. But as preparations intensified, the operation's diplomatic tightrope grew more precarious. Spanish authorities on Fernando Po were known for inconsistent loyalty, some sympathetic to the Allies, others quietly pro-Axis. Declassified correspondence reveals that British consular staff on the island fed discreet information to the WWII, but warned that the Spanish governor's vigilance increased whenever British ships lingered offshore. One letter, stamped Most Secret, to be destroyed after reading, described how the governor had received informal warnings that British irregular forces might attempt unwelcome actions. Who delivered these warnings remains unknown. On the night of January 13, 1942, the WWII raiders departed from the converted trawler HMS Vulcan, accompanied by the smaller vessel Nuneaton. Moving under blackout conditions, they navigated the Gulf of Guinea's humid darkness. At 23:30, the commandos boarded motor launches and paddled into Santa Isabel Harbor. The port appeared peaceful. Lanterns flickered in distant streets, and only 2 Spanish guards patrolled the piers. But the harbor's calm masked a looming danger. Had the Spanish authorities been tipped off, even subtly, the raiders risked immediate arrest or lethal confrontation. The reveal came minutes later. As the raiding party approached the Duchessa d'Aosta, a Spanish customs officer unexpectedly stepped onto the quay, lantern in hand. According to WWII logs, he paused, noticing movement on the water. For nearly 10 seconds, he watched the small silhouettes glide toward the moored vessels. Then, perhaps assuming it was a local fishing crew, he turned away and disappeared into a warehouse. That quiet moment, recorded in a single line of March Phillips' after-action report, represented the mission's knife edge. One shout, one challenge, and Operation Postmaster would have ignited a diplomatic crisis. Once aboard the Axis vessels, the commandos worked with astonishing coordination. Prize crews secured the Italian and German sailors still sleeping, while sappers cut mooring cables and rigged tow lines. By 0:25, all 3 ships were under control and ready for extraction. Only then did the harbor wake to chaos, horns blaring, guards shouting, and dock workers rushing to the quayside. But it was too late. The WWII's vessels, engines roaring at last, pulled their prizes into open water. The Admiralty's official communiques later credited the operation with disrupting Axis intelligence in West Africa and boosting Allied morale. What they did not discuss, and what later released files imply, was how dangerously close the mission came to exposure. Spanish intelligence records from the early 1940s reference suspicious foreign activity in the weeks before the raid. Some historians argue the WWII may have manipulated local informants more extensively than acknowledged, or used deception operations to mislead Spanish officials about British movements. Others suggest that the disappearance of certain messages from Spanish records hints at quiet diplomatic intervention after the fact. Operation Postmaster succeeded, but it left behind questions, ones that still sit uneasily with scholars of WWII history. What exactly did Spanish officials know? How close did Britain come to igniting an international scandal? And why were certain operational documents withheld from public release until the early 2000s? These uncertainties, along with the operation's undeniable audacity, set the stage for Britain's final and most politically entangled covert naval mission of the war, one carried out as the conflict neared its brutal climax. As 1945 approached, the tide of war had unmistakably turned. Germany was retreating, the U-boats were losing dominance in the Atlantic, and Allied armies were closing in from east and west. Yet, even in these final months, the Admiralty's covert naval operations did not simply fade into the background. Instead, they underwent a final evolution, one shaped by political sensitivities, intelligence rivalries, and the unresolved mysteries left by years of classified missions. The files released decades later show that Britain's most secretive naval actions in the war's final phase were not merely about sinking ships or gathering intelligence. They were about controlling the narrative of victory, protecting sources, and ensuring that certain shadows remained undisturbed. The struggle in early 1945 centered around safeguarding the Arctic convoys JW and RA, which continued to run despite the collapsing German Navy. These convoys were vital for maintaining Soviet cooperation and ensuring post-war political stability. Even with the Tirpitz destroyed in late 1944, lingering threats remained. U-boat flotillas still operated from Trondheim and Narvik, while remnants of the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet sheltered in fjords under heavy camouflage. British intelligence feared that German commanders, desperate to influence peace negotiations, might attempt a final dramatic strike against an Allied convoy. This concern triggered a new wave of covert reconnaissance operations conducted by small Royal Navy units working closely with the intelligence community. One such unit was the 30 Assault Unit, $30, created by Commander Ian Fleming, the future author of the James Bond novels. Though often remembered for their post-landing operations in Normandy, by 1945 these specialists shifted focus to gathering naval intelligence through stealthy insertions along occupied coastlines. Supported by the Royal Navy's coastal forces, they used motor torpedo boats, MTBs, and small landing craft to approach Norwegian fjords at night, landing 2- or 3-man reconnaissance teams tasked with photographing bunkers, radar stations, and anchorages. Unlike earlier special operations, these missions were not designed to destroy targets. They were designed to uncover intentions. The insights gained from these insertions were vital. Intelligence reports revealed that the Germans were repositioning U-boats to attempt a final mass attack against an eastbound convoy. Signals intelligence decrypted by Hut 8 at Bletchley Park supported this conclusion. But the Admiralty faced a dilemma. Responding too visibly risked compromising the secret sources that supplied this information. Thus, covert naval monitoring intensified, guided by the lessons learned from years of clandestine operations, from the X-Craft missions to the canoe-borne raids of the Special Boat Section. One operation undertaken in early March 1945 involved inserting a combined SBS 30 AU team near the entrance to Perseindrifjord, where German U-boats were believed to be staging. Using a modified MTB with muffled engines, the team deployed in a small boat under the cover of a moonless night. Their orders were to observe, not engage. Yet according to declassified reports, the team discovered more than expected, evidence of German preparations for a last-ditch convoy strike far larger than Allied command had suspected. They identified fuel barges, increased radio traffic, and at least 4 U-boats loading torpedoes. The team remained hidden for nearly 36 hours before extraction, longer than planned due to increased patrols. The men returned exhausted, frostbitten, and shaken by the scale of what they'd seen. But the reveal followed shortly after. As Allied naval units prepared to counter this threat, several intelligence anomalies emerged. Signals intercept suddenly ceased from one of the U-boat groups. Aerial reconnaissance found 2 U-boats missing from their usual berths, with no explanation in German logs intercepted later. Some historians argue these submarines had been redeployed toward deeper, more defensible waters. Others believe they attempted to break northward for a final excursion into the Arctic ice. But a handful of declassified British documents, heavily redacted, mention a possible scuttling under operation-level secrecy, without identifying who ordered it or why. Whether these references relate to the missing U-boats or an entirely separate intelligence event remains unknown. Simultaneously, a quiet political struggle unfolded within the Allied command structure. As the end of the war loomed, nations sought to protect sensitive intelligence relationships. MI6 and the Naval Intelligence Division wanted to secure the secrecy of certain assets, local informants, code-breaking capabilities, and maritime surveillance technologies. Some files suggest that British leadership deliberately withheld or sanitized after-action reports from several late-war coastal operations to avoid revealing how deeply they had penetrated German communications. In other cases, the records appear to gloss over operational difficulties, losses, or mistakes. Whether these omissions were intended to preserve morale, shape post-war narratives, or shield intelligence sources remains debated among historians. The last phase of classified naval missions thus became a balancing act between disclosure and silence. The Admiralty recognized that even victorious operations could create diplomatic complications. Norway, soon to be liberated, would discover the extent of Allied covert activity around its coastline. The Soviet Union, an uneasy ally, would scrutinize British intelligence successes in Arctic waters. Every decision about what to reveal and what to obscure carried consequences beyond the battlefield. As May 1945 approached and Germany collapsed, most covert naval operations were quietly wound down. Some personnel returned to their original units. Others, particularly those in the SBS and $30 were redeployed to assist with the capture and assessment of German naval technology, including the revolutionary Type XXI U-boat. Yet many missions remained unspoken. Families received only minimal notifications. Files went into vaults, sealed for decades. When these documents were finally declassified in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they painted a more nuanced picture of Britain's covert naval war, a story of ingenuity, sacrifice, and shadows. Not all mysteries were resolved. Several men lost during training or operations were never recovered. Certain intelligence anomalies, interrupted signals, missing submarines, unexplained equipment failures, still have no definitive explanation. And the boundaries between wartime necessity and post-war secrecy remain blurred. But together, these classified missions reveal the hidden architecture of Britain's naval strategy in World War II, a strategy shaped not only by ships and steel, but by human resilience, secrecy, and the quiet recognition that some of the war's most important victories occurred far from public view. And even now, pieces of that story remain locked away, waiting for the next release of files and the next set of questions.